Down in the swamps of southern Louisiana, where the Spanish moss hangs heavy and the Mississippi Delta hides its darkest truths, there's a story so unsettling that local historians have tried to erase it for over a century. In 1863, while cannons roared across distant battlefields, something more sinister than war unfolded at Belmont Plantation. In a single night, 73 enslaved people vanished without explanation. 17 members of the family died under suspicious circumstances within half a year. And at the center of it all was a marriage so forbidden it was silenced under threat of death. The union of 67-year-old Cornelius Thibodeau and his 16-year-old granddaughter, Celeste Marie Thibodeau. What survived of this tale was buried in courthouse basements, sealed in family vaults, and whispered only in the most secret corners of Creole society. The fragments that escaped a mysterious courthouse fire in 1889 tell of madness passed down through generations, carefully plotted murder, and a conspiracy that stretched into the highest ranks of Louisiana's plantation elite. Belmont was no small estate. It sprawled across 8,000 acres of sugar fields, its Gothic revival mansion standing like a monument to Southern excess. Built in 1834 by Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, a French immigrant who carved his fortune from sugar, the plantation embodied the wealth and cruelty of the Old South. But by 1863, the Civil War had stripped away that grandeur. Federal blockades strangled trade, Confederate money was worthless, and Union troops were pressing deeper into Louisiana. Cornelius Thibodeau, who had inherited both vast wealth and the strange customs of his Franco-Louisiana roots, ruled over Belmont like a shadow. He was a towering man, over 6 feet tall, with steel-gray eyes and a scar from a duel etched across his face. Always dressed in black, the enslaved called him Lorbeau the Raven. Unlike neighboring planters, the Thibodeau family clung to old-world traditions tied to French aristocracy. They belonged to a hidden society known as Les Gardiens du Sang Pur, the Guardians of Pure Blood. This brotherhood, older than Louisiana itself, believed that intermarriage within chosen lines preserved not just wealth, but a mystical force they called La Force Ancestrale. Cornelius wore their silver medallion and kept their secrets. He had been widowed since 1856, after his wife Evangeline's mysterious death, officially marked as consumption, though servants whispered about violent wounds on her body. His only son Henri had married Isabelle Landry, and in 1847 they had one child, Celeste. But tragedy struck again in 1863 when Henri and Isabelle were killed in a so-called carriage accident. The official story blamed Union artillery for spooking the horses. Yet witnesses swore the wreck happened before any fighting, and the carriage itself showed signs of deliberate sabotage. From there, the Thibodeau bloodline's descent into darkness only deepened, with Celeste forced into the forbidden union that sealed Belmont's fate. The so-called accident that killed Henri and Isabelle left 16-year-old Celeste Marie as the sole heir to the Thibodeau fortune, instantly making her one of the wealthiest young women in war-torn Louisiana. By every account, she was striking. Her features carried the classical beauty that Creole society idolized, with an olive complexion, cascading dark ringlets, and green eyes that seemed to shift with the light. But it was not just her beauty that set her apart. Celeste was unusually sharp for her age, fluent in French, Spanish, and English, and educated far beyond what was typical for women of her time. She had a way of cutting through falsehoods that unsettled even the most powerful adults around her. Yet her inheritance came tied to a plantation with secrets darker than the whip. Belmont's slave quarters were not laid out in the neat rows found on most estates. Instead, they were arranged in a vast geometric pattern that from above formed something eerily like a ritual circle. The enslaved lived under constant fear, not only of brutal punishment, but of unexplained disappearances. Rumors spread of the Belmont vanishings, with missing men and women dismissed as runaways or victims of fever. In truth, their bodies often turned up in a hidden cemetery deep beneath sprawling oaks draped with moss. The graves bore only numbers, not names, and by 1863, the tally had climbed well past 300. It was against this backdrop that Cornelius Tibito delivered a proclamation that stunned even the hardest men of Louisiana's plantation belt. On September 15, 1863, as mist rolled off the bayous and deserters from the Confederate Army drifted through the swamps, Cornelius announced his intention to marry his granddaughter Celeste. The declaration came not in church or at a gathering of family, but during a private meeting with his overseer, Etienne Boudreau, a man whose reputation for cruelty already set him apart. Boudreau had been delivering grim news about the failing plantation finances when Cornelius calmly interrupted. "The solution to our troubles lies not in selling land or reducing operations." Cornelius said, his voice as steady as if he were ordering supper. "It lies in an ancient provision of our family charter." He drew from his desk a worn leather case, brass hinges green with age, and produced yellow documents penned in archaic French. Reading them aloud with a cadence that bordered on ritual, he recited the words of the 1834 royal grant that established Belmont Plantation. According to its founding charter, all lands and holdings were to remain in the direct Tibito bloodline forever. And should the continuation of that bloodline be endangered, the patriarch could enact emergency provisions, including the right to take any female descendant as wife, in order to preserve the family inheritance. Boudreau, hardened by years of violence and cruelty, went pale. Even in Louisiana, where some Creole dynasties intermarried to protect their fortunes, what Cornelius described was beyond taboo. "Sir," he managed, his voice trembling, "you cannot mean this. The girl is your granddaughter." Cornelius's cold reply silenced him. "Such a union is entirely legal under the provisions of our charter. More than that, it is necessary to preserve what our ancestors built." And as Boudreau's protests faltered, his eyes fell on something behind Cornelius that made his blood freeze, proof that the old man's plan was already in motion. Around Cornelius's neck, half hidden beneath his starched collar, glinted the silver medallion Etienne Boudreau had seen before. It was the mark of the old blood societies worn only by the most secretive and dangerous families in Louisiana. The emblem, a twisted tree with branches knotted into shapes that made the eyes ache, was proof enough that Cornelius's plan was no idle threat. That night, as storm clouds split the Louisiana sky and lightning danced across the sugar fields, Cornelius summoned Celeste to his study. The room was a mausoleum of family power. Oil portraits of stern-faced Thibodeaux stared down from the walls, their gazes following every movement. Ledgers recording decades of harvests, slave sales, and debts lined the shelves. On the desk sat relics of the family's past, a crystal inkwell once gifted by a governor, Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau's letter opener, and sealed documents stamped with red wax. Celeste entered with the composure drilled into her since childhood. But her eyes betrayed suspicion. Since her parents' deaths, she had sensed too many lies in her grandfather's explanations. "Sit, my dear," Cornelius said, pointing to a chair that forced her back toward the only exit. She obeyed, but never let her guard drop. He launched into his plan with the certainty of a man who had already won. He spoke of duty bloodlines and a divine inheritance, his voice low and rhythmic, carrying the weight of ritual. Yet Celeste focused less on his words than on the small betrayals in his manner. His fingers tapped the desk in patterns that mirrored the symbol on his medallion. His eyes slid past hers, never holding them. And worst of all, there was the thin smile tugging at his lips when he mentioned her parents' tragic accident. The marriage will take place on October 13th. He declared, his tone as flat and final as a business decree. It will be private. Only those who understand the sacred duty we uphold will attend. You will give your consent. It was not a request. It was a verdict. And when Celeste met his gaze, what she saw was not grief, not love, but the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. In the weeks that followed, Belmont changed. Word of the intended marriage escaped the plantation walls, despite Cornelius's attempts to smother it. The Creole elite reacted with alarm. Families like the Boudreaux and the Nazis sent letters polite in tone, but edged with outrage. Even in a culture that tolerated marriages of cousins and kin, Cornelius's plan crossed a line that could not be defended. More troubling still were the midnight visits. 3 times emissaries of Le Gardien du Sang Pur arrived at Belmont under cover of darkness, each wearing the medallion of the twisted tree. They conferred with Cornelius in hushed French until dawn, and each time he emerged more restless, more volatile. Meanwhile, Celeste turned her intelligence against him. With the same discipline she had once applied to managing accounts and correspondence, she sifted through household ledgers, scraps of letters, and whispers overheard in darkened halls. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Her parents' carriage crash had not been misfortune, it had been orchestrated. Among her father's papers, she uncovered proof of a bitter quarrel between Henri and Cornelius just days before the so-called accident. Henri had discovered irregularities in the family finances, a trail that pointed not only to fraud, but to something older. Something tied to the society her grandfather served. Cornelius's corruption was laid bare in the evidence Celeste uncovered. Her father, Henri, had discovered that Cornelius was siphoning money from plantation accounts, funneling profits into gambling dens, and paying debts owed to the shadowy society of Le Gardien du Sang Pur. To hide the theft, Cornelius sold entire enslaved families in secret transactions, their names erased from ledgers as if they had never existed. But the most damning revelation was that Henri had confronted his father directly, threatening not only to cut Celeste off from Belmont's reach, but to expose the society's dealings to federal authorities. The argument ended with Henri planning to spirit Celeste away to relatives in New Orleans, far from Cornelius's control. Yet the carriage that was meant to carry them to safety never arrived, its fate sealed by sabotage. Celeste's search for answers led her deeper into Belmont's hidden places. Guided by maps in her father's papers, she found the unmarked cemetery concealed beneath the moss-draped oaks. What she uncovered there was more horrifying than any rumor whispered by the enslaved. The numbered graves weren't records of natural deaths or disease. They marked deliberate killings. Every grave held someone who had known too much or stood in Cornelius's way. Some mounds were heartbreakingly small-sized for children. Others were freshly dug, the earth still soft. Worse still, several graves were dated after her parents' deaths, proof that Cornelius had already begun eliminating anyone who might resist his marriage scheme. The truth dawned on Celeste with a clarity that left her trembling. This was not simply about wealth or social standing. Le Gardien du Sang Pur had convinced themselves that power itself flowed through bloodlines, and that by controlling marriages, no matter how grotesque, they could preserve a force greater than fortune. Cornelius had come to believe he could bend life and death to his will. The society's history revealed similar unions among other Louisiana dynasties, and always the results were monstrous. Children born of these unions were frail, disfigured, or disturbed. Yet the society declared their deformities signs of purification. Those who survived often became violent, devoid of empathy, mirroring their parents' cruelty. Then Celeste discovered the most terrifying truth of all. Hidden within coded ledgers and private correspondence, she found that Cornelius's plan did not end with the wedding. He intended to kill her on their wedding night once he believed she had conceived. He was convinced her death would fulfill a ritual granting him renewed life and dominion over Belmont forever. With the ceremony set for October 13th, Celeste had only days to act. On October 10th, she made her choice. She would not submit. If she was destined to die, she would drag her grandfather and as many of his conspirators into the abyss with her. But she also resolved to leave behind proof of what she had learned. She wrote detailed letters to newspaper editors, federal officials, and religious leaders, describing the hidden graves, the society's rituals, and Cornelius's monstrous plan. These letters would be her legacy, her insurance against Belmont's crimes, vanishing into silence. But letters alone would not stop him. For that, Celeste turned to the plantation's herb garden, a place tended by elderly enslaved women whose knowledge stretched back generations. In the shadows of the garden, among rows of rosemary and sage, they had preserved secrets far older and more dangerous than Cornelius Tibito's twisted rituals. Celeste gathered her instruments of revenge quietly, and with a steady hand harvesting foxglove, nightshade, oleander, and other plants from the old herb garden plants that in the hands of a skilled woman could be turned from folk medicine into a precise and deadly compound. While the household fussed over ribbons and candles, she played the obedient granddaughter, smiling at relatives and society members, and letting them believe she would accept her fate, all the while slipping tiny glass vials into hidden pockets sewn into her grandmother's white silk gown. The morning of October 13th, 1863, arrived with an unseasonable chill that settled into bones and porch boards alike, and the usual life of the plantation was gone. Birds and voices and insect song swallowed by a hush that made the Spanish moss hang without stirring. Men of the society came in by secret routes and slipped into the outbuildings, each wearing the silver medallion that marked him as a guardian of pure blood, moving with the confidence of men who believed they acted above law and God. Dr. Alonzo Heber from New Orleans stood among them, with his black medical bag, a physician who kept dangerous knowledge private and who would both officiate and tend to any complications. Judge Armand Fontino was there to make the union legally binding on paper, to bend records if need be. Captain Lucien Dufresne, brutal and connected, made sure the society had the muscle to silence problems. As afternoon bled into evening, the preparations took on a ritual air, not the polite traditions of a Creole wedding, but a secret rite held in the mansion basement, a stone chamber carved with symbols that seemed to shift in candlelight. A place built for purposes Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau never explained. Cornelius oversaw every detail with a fevered intensity, placing black candles, arranging chairs for the witnesses, muttering to empty air as if ancestors answered him. His eyes had a glassy focus, and his hands tapped in patterns that matched the twisted tree on his medallion. Celeste spent the day in a room upstairs, pretending to ready herself, while she measured doses for different ends, some vials intended to bring fast death, others to produce slow, convincing illness so suspicion would travel too late. She packed her letters to editors, to federal officials, and to clergy into envelopes she hoped would survive whatever came next, proof that would not be buried in unmarked graves. Then she folded the last vial into her sleeve and went down to meet the men who thought they had already won. To anyone watching Celeste was the picture of submission, her slender frame draped in white silk, her face pale with what seemed like dread. But beneath that facade burned a resolve sharper than steel. Her mind, trained by loss and sharpened by grief, was focused not on survival alone, but on ending the legacy of cruelty that had poisoned Belmont for generations. When she slipped her mother's silver locket around her neck with the words, "The sins of Belmont Plantation end with me tucked inside," it was less ornament than declaration, a vow that tonight would be the last night her family's curse ruled unchecked. At 8 o'clock, thunder rolled over the bayous as Cornelius came for her, his arm trembling with excitement as he guided her down into the heart of the mansion. He saw only compliance in her calm smile, never suspecting the vials hidden in her gown, or the paper-thin blade of resolve she carried in her heart. The basement chamber was nothing like a church or parlor. It was a place meant for secrecy and shadow. Symbols older than the cross were etched deep into the stone-black candles, flickered in unnatural drafts, and incense clung to the air with a sweetness so cloying it seemed to choke out breath itself. Underneath lingered another odor, damp earth and the faint, unmistakable scent of decay. The men of the society stood in a circle, their silver medallions flashing in the candlelight. They wore formal coats and polished shoes, the trappings of refinement, meant to mask the depravity of what they were about to sanctify. At the altar, Dr. Haber opened a grotesque volume bound in something disturbingly like human skin. Its pages, filled with shifting script in corrupted Latin and archaic tongues, seemed alive in the glow of the flames. He read aloud in cadences that felt designed to hypnotize his voice, weaving through the stone chamber until it became part of the walls themselves. As the words filled the air, the other men began to hum a low resonance that made the floor tremble faintly under Celeste's feet. The sound vibrated in her chest like a second heartbeat. Judge Fontenot muttered nervously when several candles guttered at once. But Cornelius, enthralled, only lifted his chin as if to welcome unseen forces. Captain Dufresne guarded the single door, his hand resting on the worn hilt of his saber, his presence a warning that no one would leave until the ritual was complete. Celeste walked with deliberate grace, her green eyes flicking from man to man, measuring distance, noting exits, gauging weakness. To them she looked like a frightened girl being marched toward a fate she dared not resist. In truth, she was already calculating the moment to act. And as the first phrases of the binding ritual echoed off the cold stone, she felt the weight of the vials pressing against her ribs, each one a weapon more potent than any saber or pistol. Judge Fontenot waited with his pen poised over papers that would make the marriage official and hand the Thibodeau fortune to Cornelius. But his ink never found its page, because as the ritual reached its peak, something in the chamber began to go very wrong. Men who had stood proud a moment before started to sweat and cough, faces flushing or paling, breath coming in ragged gasps, as if the air itself had turned traitor, and Dr. Heber, who had first shrugged it off as emotion, watched with growing alarm as the symptoms multiplied until there was no denying a common cause. What none of them knew was that Celeste had spent the afternoon turning the chamber into a trap, tainting incense wine and candles with compounds she would not have been able to name aloud in a courtroom, but whose effects she understood well enough to use and then deny. And when the moment came, and Dr. Heber lifted the grotesque book for the final reading, Celeste stepped forward with a false, quiet gentleness and interrupted the cadence as if remembering a long recited line. She spoke about family and tradition and then produced a silver tray of crystal glasses, each filled with wine and smelling faintly of earth. And when she told them the vintage came from the soil of the family cemetery, the room changed. Whispers snapped into silence. Several men lurched back. Dufresne's hand went toward his saber, and then stilled as he tried to measure the real threat. And Cornelius, at last seeing that his secrets had been found, snarled that she had no idea what forces she toyed with. Celeste smiled and raised a glass, and dared them to drink the fruit of their crimes first, and for a heartbeat the choice hung between exposure and survival. Then the first man took the cup, compelled by arrogance or by the hope that denial would keep him safe. And within heartbeats, his composure cracked. His speech slurred, his vision folded in on itself, and chaos replaced ceremony. Some men convulsed and fell. Others staggered into the stone walls, moaning about specters and buried faces. Captain Dufresne slashed through the nearest chair in a blind effort to reach an exit, while Cornelius lunged toward Celeste with a roar that split the humming chant. But he had not accounted for the household servants and the old women who had tended the herb garden. Bound by fear for years, and now by something like courage, they surged into the chamber at the first sign of disorder, seizing weapons and slamming the heavy door shut. And in the confusion, Cornelius found himself unmoored, his saber slipping from his grasp as his knees buckled, and when he reached for Celeste, she met him with neither pleading nor pity, but with the cold resolve of someone who had already buried a life and was determined not to be buried with it. What followed was a blur of smoke, shouted names, and the sick sweet tang of incense gone wrong. And when the air cleared enough to make out shapes on the stone floor, a third of the men lay still or barely breathing, the rest delirious or handcuffed by those they had once ruled. Cornelius' eyes glassy and full of a final terrible recognition, whispered the names of ancestors as if pleading for mercy that did not come. And then he slumped forward, his last breath a concession to the very burial ground he had tried to hide. Celeste stood amid the ruin, trembling but upright, her locket warm against her chest, and the letters she had written now in the hands of a housemaid, who had already slipped into the night to carry them to a safe place. And as dawn smeared gray light across the plantation, the hidden cemetery was dragged into daylight by federal agents, summoned by those papers and by frightened neighbors whose curiosity the night could no longer satisfy. The society that had cloaked itself in silver medallions splintered under investigation, some members arrested. Others vanished into the chaos they had created. And though rumors and lawsuits would swirl around Belmont for years, and though the scars in the land and in the people who lived there would take generations to fade, Celeste's declaration that the sins of Belmont Plantation would end with her did not go unrecorded. It survived in ink and in testimony, and in the end, the numbered graves were opened and named as best they could be named. While Celeste, forever altered by what she had done and what she had lost, walked away from the ruins of the only home she had known, carrying the small silver locket and the knowledge that some inheritances are worth destroying rather than preserving. The shattered glass still smoked at Celeste's feet, the acrid vapor crawling along the chamber floor, as though the stones themselves were exhaling the truth. For the first time in their long careers of secrecy and cruelty, the men of Le Gardien du Sang-Pur found themselves cornered. Captain Dufresne's saber wavered as his eyes watered, his body struggling against the toxins saturating the air. Judge Fontenot's polished composure had collapsed into a mask of guilt, his lips trembling as Celeste listed the very crimes he had worked so hard to bury. And Cornelius, stripped of his patriarch's authority, stood revealed as nothing more than a tyrant, clinging to the delusion that murder and corruption were sacrifice. Celeste's words cut like steel. An empire of death and suffering, that is your legacy, grandfather. Not honor, not strength, not some divine calling. Just bodies in the ground and blood on your hands. She held the leather journal aloft, its cracked spine and yellowed pages proof against any denial. These are your words, not mine. 317 graves. Every number a life stolen for your greed and your madness. The chamber erupted in confusion. Some of the society members staggered forward, coughing, begging for mercy. Others tried to lunge towards Celeste, only to collapse against the walls as the poisons worked deeper into their veins. Dr. Haber fumbled with his bag, but his fingers trembled too violently to grasp the instruments inside. Judge Fontenot, pale and drenched in sweat, fell to his knees, his voice breaking as he tried to offer testimony bargains, anything to save himself. Cornelius advanced through the chaos, his tall frame still imposing, despite the tremors running through his body. His eyes bloodshot and wild, locked onto Celeste with a hatred that stripped away any pretense of family. "You think you can destroy us with words and poison," he growled, his voice raw. "You are Thibodeau. My blood flows in your veins. You cannot escape it." Celeste backed toward the hidden passage, her hand brushing against the carved seam she had discovered in the stone wall. The storm outside rumbled like cannon fire, rattling the chamber and punctuating her reply. "Your blood may be in my veins, but it will end with me. Tonight the Thibodeau name dies, and with it this vile society you've shackled to our family." Cornelius lunged his hands, reaching not for a weapon, but for her throat. Yet before he could close the distance, another of Celeste's vials shattered against the floor between them, releasing a wave of fumes so sharp and bitter that he reeled backward, choking. Around them, the society members coughed, stumbled and fell, their medallions clattering to the stones like useless coins. Celeste turned the locket at her neck over in her hand, whispering the words she had written within it, as if sealing them into the air. "The sins of Belmont Plantation end with me." Then, with one last look at the man who had once been her grandfather, and was now only a monster, writhing in his own poison, she pressed the hidden catch in the wall and slipped into the darkness of the passage. Cornelius rounded the final bend in the narrow passage and found Celeste standing calm beside a table strewn with powders, lengths of fuse and metal canisters she had scavenged from the plantation storehouses, and the overseers shed his silhouette filling the doorway like a living accusation, while she looked at him without flinching, as if she had been waiting not for mercy, but for this moment of truth. He lunged, hands clawing at her dress, fury and denial tumbling from him, in equal measure proclaiming that the bloodline had to be preserved and that she would never understand the weight of what he had done. But Celeste moved with a cool, terrible clarity, telling him that the Thibodeau legacy was built on theft and murder, and that she had gathered what was needed to erase the last stones of his empire rather than let his crimes stand. And for a beat, he mocked her certain threats, and swagger could undo what she had set in motion. Then, reality intruded in the form of muffled screams and crashing echoes from the chamber below, as the poisoned men staggered into one another, and the household fought to contain the chaos, and Captain Dufresne, still slashing at imagined foes, blundered into the passage, stumbling toward them like a wounded animal. Cornelius sprang forward to seize Celeste, but the old ropes of control snapped as the fumes and panic took hold. His hand closing on empty air as she stepped aside, and in the same instant a maid and two of the garden women burst through a side exit, faces streaked with soot and resolve seizing Dufresne and pulling him away, while Celeste struck a single match to the fuse she had lit earlier to slow the trail, and then threw a second into a prepared cache, not to slaughter innocents, but to collapse the room meant to hide the dead, and the documents to bring daylight to what had been buried. The explosion ripped through the stone corridor like a verdict, sending a cloud of dust and broken masonry up the passage and down into the great house, toppling Cornelius off his feet and burying ancient ledgers and the twisted medallions under a heap of brick and timber. And when the smoke thinned, the scene was one of ruin and silence. Cornelius, coughing and clawing his final protests, reduced to strangled pleas as rescuers dragged him free, only to see the life drain from his face, while in the aftermath, servants and terrified neighbors hauled the wounded into the yard. And a housemaid, already on her way, had the letters Celeste had entrusted to her, running through the night to New Orleans to place them in the hands of editors and federal agents. And by dawn, soldiers and investigators were moving across Belmont, opening hidden graves, cataloging names where numbers had been, and seizing papers that could not be erased. The Les Gardiens du Sang Pur splintered as members were arrested. Some fled, others hanged on their own reputations. And though lawsuits and whispers dogged Celeste for years, the evidence she had forced into the light could not be undone. So she walked away from the smoking ruins with a little silver locket at her throat and a bundle of testimony and money given by freed hands. A woman who had traded a bloodline for a future she would build on her own terms, forever marked by what she had done. Haunted by faces she could not unsee, but certain that the sins of Belmont would no longer be passed down in silence. The blast tore the heart out of Belmont, and in the smoke and roar, the last cruel chapter of the Thibodeau reign closed with a terrible clarity. Everyone in the basement was gone, and the fire that followed reduced the mansion, the slave quarters, and the outbuildings to ash and warped iron. But the proof Celeste had smuggled out in the letters could not be burned, and those pages set a chain of events in motion that the plantation's masters had never meant to survive. Federal investigators arrived amid rumors of Confederate sabotage, and at first accepted the wartime explanation. But the letters and the testimony of frightened servants and neighbors forced deeper scrutiny, and one by one the society's networks began to fray. Judge Fontenot was found dead in his office under circumstances that suggested poison. Dr. Heber vanished without a trace. Captain Dufresne was later found raving and disfigured by his own hand, and other men tied to the guardianship simply disappeared or died in accidents that smelled suspicious to anyone willing to ask. Federal agents exhumed the hidden cemetery as best they could, turning numbered mounds into names where possible and placing markers for those they could not identify. Though many graves were too degraded, many more bodies missing, and the full tally of the lost would never be known. Lawsuits and whispers followed, reputations shattered, and the secretive orders that had once moved like shadow governments through the bayou were broken, but not entirely erased. Families changed their names, moved away, and some members vanished into the exile of guilt or madness, carrying with them pieces of a corruption that would continue to haunt courts and county histories for years. The plantation lands were parceled off, sold and resold. And where the mansion once rose, the ground held a scar that locals refused to ignore. A place people crossed the road to avoid at night, and where children were warned never to play. In New Orleans, editors printed Celeste's letters, ministers preached about sin and redemption, and federal clerks cataloged evidence that would help convict a handful of conspirators, but many who had colluded in silence were never held to account. In the end, the name Thibodeau faded from polite conversation and became a cautionary tale. The silver medallion, a relic of horror, passed between collectors and court clerks, while the small silver locket that had rested against a dying girl's chest survived, entrusted to a housemaid who fled with it and later sold it to help bury the dead she had loved. The sins of Belmont did not vanish without cost, and neither did the memory of what one young woman did to force the truth into daylight. But for all the bodies and all the burned ledgers, some of the lost were finally named, and for a moment at least, the bayou seemed a little less heavy with secrets. His carriage was discovered abandoned on a lonely parish road, splattered with blood and bearing the marks of a violent struggle, yet no trace of Dr. Heber was ever found. Captain Lucien Dufresne met a darker end discovered in his quarters with his own saber through his chest. A death that officials hesitated to label suicide, but could not explain otherwise. One by one, the men who had gathered in Belmont's basement either vanished, were found dead, or were dragged into courtrooms as federal investigators pursued the trail Celeste had left behind. Armed with her letters, the government seized bank ledgers, property deeds, and family records that stretched back decades. Graves were opened, plots examined, and fraudulent wills uncovered. The findings confirmed the worst of the allegations: systematic murder, fraudulent transfers of wealth, and a conspiracy that had reached into the highest ranks of Louisiana's antebellum society. By the close of 1864, Le Gardien du Sang Pur no longer existed in any recognizable form. Some members fled to Mexico or across the Atlantic. Others faced trial for crimes ranging from fraud to murder. And many more simply disappeared, whether by suicide, betrayal within their own circle, or the vengeance of those who had once feared them. The society seized fortunes, stripped from vaults, and hidden accounts were turned toward reconstruction efforts, funding schools and hospitals for freedmen across Louisiana. Belmont itself was never rebuilt. The ashes of the mansion were left to sink into the swampy ground, and the land was eventually broken into smaller farms, sold to owners who had no interest in remembering what once stood there. Yet the locals would not tread near the ruins. They whispered of voices in the night, ghostly conversations in archaic French phantom carriage wheels, clattering over roads long since reclaimed by cane and cypress, and most unsettling of all, the sound of a young woman's voice singing lullabies in an unrecognizable tongue. Over time, the truth blurred. White historians and descendants of society families worked diligently to cleanse the record. Archivists were bribed, documents burned, and official histories painted antebellum Louisiana with the familiar gloss of magnolias and hospitality. Yet among African American families of the parishes, stories endured, passed down quietly, generation to generation. They spoke of the numbered graves, the midnight ceremonies, the girl who chose vengeance, and the fire that consumed the House of Horrors. In 1889, 26 years after Belmont burned, a fire swept through the Vermilion Parish Courthouse. Nearly all records of antebellum plantation ownership were lost in the blaze, which investigators concluded had been set deliberately. No culprit was ever named. Among the few surviving fragments was a single page from a marriage register dated October 13, 1863. It bore two names, Cornelius Thibodeau and Celeste Marie. Thibodeau, beside a chilling notation scrawled in the margin, "Ceremony interrupted." Participants deceased. Modern historians dismiss the darker tales as folklore, exaggerated wartime propaganda, or post-war invention. They argue the scope of the alleged conspiracy would have required too many participants, too much secrecy to remain hidden. Yet in dusty archive boxes and forgotten county records, troubling evidence lingers. Deeds that trace land holdings across generations of families who married against law and custom. Journals that hint at societies and oaths never acknowledged in polite histories. Each discovery suggests that the story of Belmont Plantation may not be folklore at all, but a glimpse into a truth that was never meant to see daylight. This closing is excellent. It ties the historical horror of Belmont into a modern legend, blending fact, folklore, and mystery in a way that feels chilling and unresolved. You've built a strong arc from the roots of the Thibodeau family's corruption through Celeste's defiance and sacrifice to the haunting echoes that stretch into the present. The final call to action comments: subscribing, sharing feels natural for a YouTube video and fits the tone of a true crime folk horror channel. If you'd like, I can smooth it into a slightly more polished final narration. Voice over something that feels like the haunting last words of a documentary episode. For example, emphasizing the unanswered questions, the strange sightings in the present, and the enduring power of one girl's defiance. That would keep the rhythm taut and the suspense alive right to the last line.